I think it puts huge pressure on the Australian government. The imagery of that many people walking across the bridge was particularly striking, and is again a mark of the frustration and devastation amongst Australian voters about what the Australian government is not doing to prevent incredible suffering in Gaza.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello and welcome to this crossover special of Follow the Money and After America. I'm Glenn Connley, Senior Media Advisor at the Australia Institute. How do you handle bad news? Ever heard the phrase, shooting the messenger?
Donald Trump is firing the Commissioner of Labor Statistics, accusing the commissioner of faking the jobs numbers in a Truth Social post.
Days before the election, she came out with these beautiful numbers for Kamala.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is, around the world, the most trusted gold standard of jobs reporting numbers, issued a report that revised job growth, showing that job growth in the United States had slowed to a near halt.
Going forward, why should anyone trust the numbers? Well, that's the big thing. You're right. No, you're right. Why should anybody trust numbers?
Last week, US President Donald Trump fired the official in charge of labour statistics shortly after the latest data showed jobs growth had slowed. As the president continues to show brazen disregard for the institutions of government, and as his popularity tanks, he and his officials have been out over the weekend doing their level best to reset the narrative. That means returning to the Trump playbook of just making stuff up, building on a deep layer of conspiracy he's helped to embed in American politics and culture. It's how Trump operates abroad as well. Never mind reality, in South Africa, in Iran, in Gaza. It's all part of the show. Joining me to discuss the crisis in Gaza, the latest with AUKUS, and what's going on with the Trump administration is Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs here at the Australia Institute. Welcome, Emma.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
The images coming out of Gaza are almost too painful to watch, Emma, but we must watch. The Gaza Health Ministry says the death toll has passed 60,000 since October 2023. Are you noticing a change in the language of the international response?
I think, Glenn, there has been a shift in the international response that is in itself in response to the images that we are seeing coming out of Gaza. I think there are some notable changes, and there have been in the last week or so, where Canada, France and the UK have indicated that they will take steps towards recognising the Palestinian state, which internationally isn't unusual. Something like 148 members of the United Nations have recognised Palestine as a state, but to have France and the UK in particular, given their historic role in that region, to be talking about that is an indication, I think, that Western states at least are starting to take this more seriously in response to grassroots protest against what the Israeli government is doing in Palestine. So we are seeing a shift, I think, but, as we've said many times on After America and in other forums, a change in language, unless it's matched by a change in actual policy, in what we're actually doing, is merely a change in language. It's just rhetoric, it's not action.
What did you make of Keir Starmer's will recognise Palestine in September, if? Good or bad?
Look, I think it's a difficult question to answer because the symbolism of that is important, given Western states' support of the Israeli government, particularly the United States, apparently no matter what, to have talk of symbolic recognition is important. But I think you're right to ask this question because for the UK and Canada, recognition is apparently going to come with conditions, where Palestine, for example, has to be demilitarized if it's to be recognised as a state, which, of course, it kind of makes that state not a sovereign state because it can't defend itself. So those conditions, of course, when you read the fine print, suggest that it wouldn't lead to a substantive change in how the issue is treated by the UK or Canada, for that matter. And again, that's where, I think the frustration is building, particularly amongst, the grassroots of the Labor Party in the UK and here as well, with, rhetoric not matching action.
I saw Trump on Air Force One saying you can't deny the starvation is happening. But what are we getting from the Trump administration as these images continue to come out?
Yeah, that's right. Trump did respond to those images, and I think that was taken as an indication, again, of his frustration that this issue is not going away for him. But there's also noise coming out of the Trump administration that it is going to take a different approach to negotiating or attempting to negotiate a ceasefire between Israel and Palestine. So it has previously taken this piecemeal approach to negotiations where it will say, there will be a staged release of hostages and a staged end to the conflict, over a 60-day period or whatever. And that was apparently in response to what the Netanyahu government wanted, because it didn't want to commit to ending the war. Trump administration is now flagging that it's going to change that approach and aim for a comprehensive deal. So the return of all of the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. Trump's envoy, Witkoff, has been flagging this in a meeting that he had with the families of Israeli hostages. So it remains to be seen how that will play out, given Netanyahu's intransigence and also given, the Republican Party's continued unconditional, really, support for Israel. So I don't think we'll see really a substantive shift in what is happening on the ground as a result of this policy change.
Israel's denial of aid and the killing of civilians, including children seeking access to water and food, cannot be defended, nor can it be ignored.
This is a lie, because we are not holding aid. Of course, we are acting in accordance to international law.
You haven't answered my question. Do you believe
can I just move on?
Sorry, you've been asked twice now.
I've said I'm very distressed by the images that I've seen.
But do you believe that that's evidence of starvation?
It's a complex situation on the ground.
The Prime Minister said this morning that it was beyond comprehension for Israel to assert that there was no starvation in Gaza. Your reaction to that comment, please?
I've just answered that.
But beyond comprehension?
Of course we're distressed by the images we see. There is no question.
I think Australian recognition of a state of Palestine is a matter of when, not if.
So from the Republican Party to the Liberal Party, the Israeli embassy here last week sort of denied there was starvation, which prompted a pretty angry response from the Prime Minister. But I was interested in Susan Lee's response, where she had this bizarre exchange with Anna Henderson from SBS, sort of refusing to agree that starvation was happening. It was just odd.
Yeah, odd is the word. Look, I think that's a reflection again of an unconditional support for Israel amongst the right here in Australia and in the United States as well, where you just see a reflection of the Israeli line that, starvation is not occurring, or if it is occurring, it's the fault of Hamas, which is blocking aid from entering. There is no evidence for that. The United Nations has described this as a worst-case scenario of famine and called for aid to be allowed into Gaza in particular immediately. And so, it was odd and it looks weird when politicians are trying to dodge questions like that, but that's just a reflection of, that unconditional support for the Israeli government that continues on the right, really across the West.
Certainly, from an Australian point of view, there was a significant moment yesterday with the Harbour Bridge protest. I think estimates are about 90,000 people. Organisers said there was 300,000. What sort of pressure does this put on the Australian government? What sort of response are we seeing from the Australian government?
Look, I think it puts huge pressure, Glenn, on the Australian government. The imagery of that many people walking across the bridge in the pouring rain as well was particularly striking, and it this shouldn't be a measure of success, but it was reported across the world. It was reported on CNN, I think, which is pretty significant in terms of global impact, and it is again a mark of the frustration and devastation amongst Australian voters about what the Australian government is not doing to prevent incredible suffering in Gaza. We saw a pretty immediate response from the Australian government to those protests on Sunday when it announced a commitment of a further $20 million in aid to Gaza that will be funneled through things like the UN's World Food Programme. So the Australian government is responding, I think, to that pressure. There has been more noise about Australian recognition of Palestine as well. The Prime Minister has said, again, kind of weirdly, now is not the time, but other representatives of the government are now effectively saying when, not if. So we are seeing a response to pressure. I think, those who walked across the bridge would say that the response isn't anywhere near enough and much more needs to be done. But things do seem to be shifting. Again, too slowly, but they are shifting.
Yeah, slowly. The Prime Minister just refusing to put a timeline on it was interesting. I think Jim Chalmers literally said it's a case of when, not if.
Yeah.
You were at the Victorian Labor Conference on the weekend. How's the ALP's rank and file looking at this unfolding situation in Gaza?
Yeah, it was so interesting observing the Victorian Labor Conference, because from my observations, the rank and file are really mobilising on this issue and have been for a really long time. But there was a motion, several motions, in fact, put up about Palestine and about recognising Palestine and imposing sanctions on Israel. There was some debate about those issues where representatives of, what we might loosely call the more right factions of the party were seeking to really, I would say, both sides the issue, and that failed comprehensively. When those motions were put to a vote, the motion calling for recognition of Palestine, calling for sanctions, calling for an end to Australian direct and indirect weapons trade with Israel passed overwhelmingly. There was no question about whether this was going to pass, and it was met with a standing ovation from the floor. There's a lot, of course, there's a lot of emotion invested in this. And I think it was really summed up for me, because there was a long conversation about this. There were panel discussions, there was a lot of to and froing about the motion and then debate about the motions themselves. And often it's kind of framed as, this is such a complex issue. We have to work so carefully and so diplomatically because of the history, because of the complexity, because of the number of countries involved. And one union rep on a panel in response to a kind of question about this complexity just said, I don't think it's fucking complicated to say stop killing people. And for me, that really encapsulates just the frustration within the grassroots of the party and more broadly, I think, in the Australian electorate.
Surely it gets harder and harder for our politicians to just sit on the fence and water things down and kick the can down the road when you're seeing these sorts of images coming out. And the guy you just quoted sums that up. You just can't sit on the fence for much longer.
I don't think so, not given what is happening in the images, that we are seeing come out of Gaza. Momentum certainly seems to be building that way. And repeatedly over the weekend when people were talking about Palestine, were talking about Israel, Labor rank and file kept going back to South Africa and protests against apartheid and the role that the Labor movement played in the 1980s in bringing the Labor Party and the Hawke government into sanctions against apartheid South Africa, and how critical that was to the eventual end of apartheid. And so it's very much being framed in that way, that the building of pressure will force a change, that eventually they will have no choice but to listen. And certainly I think there was some hope on the floor of the conference that is what is happening again.
I guess it's always happened, but you can't help but watch a Labor conference and just think the gap between what Labor voters and members want on things like Palestine, climate change, we'll get to AUKUS in a minute, tax reform, is getting bigger.
It certainly seems to be, Glenn, and it's worth saying that none of these motions, the motions on Palestine or AUKUS, which we'll get to, are binding on the federal party. They won't necessarily have any influence on actual government policy. And there was a lot of frustration evident on the floor of the conference that this is that this is the state of play. But also I think, amongst union members in particular, this is not unfamiliar, that you have to engage in this kind of long fight for justice and for human rights, and something they're very used to doing and very proud of their history of doing. And so I think that they see these issues, Palestine in particular, as part of that bigger historical fight.
And you were at the conference on a panel talking about AUKUS. Did you come away having learnt something from the conference and the opinions on AUKUS?
I did, yeah. It was evident again that there is some pretty serious discomfort with the AUKUS submarine deal amongst the Labor rank and file and amongst unionists from several different directions. I think in terms of the impact that it will have on Australian manufacturing. For example, there was a long discussion about the nuclear implications of the deal and what that would mean for unionists, many of whom have a very long and proud history of anti-nuclear activism. And so again, AUKUS is being, the AUKUS submarine deal is being connected to that longer history and looked at from a number of angles, from working class angle, from anti-nuclear angle, and from an anti-war angle. There was also quite a lot of talk of the potential for AUKUS to drag Australia into a war with alongside the United States, and who that would impact. And the argument was that it would impact union members. It would impact working class people. That working class people are the ones who suffer as the result of war. So the view of AUKUS and its risks is, I think, really comprehensive. But there's also a recognition of what it means to try and defeat something like AUKUS, when you are taking on effectively the US military industrial complex, and what that means. But again, the momentum for me seemed very clear that the grassroots is really deeply concerned about this deal and what it will mean for Australia, and is again calling on the Federal Party and the government to pretty dramatically reconsider it.
You enter into a deal with the United States where it is a part of the deal that there is a circumstance where you will not get the submarines you think you're getting.
What's remarkable about AUKUS is it was signed up without even a formal cabinet brief. It was signed up without any kind of serious scrutiny, either from within defence or within the Parliament.
When you say to the Australian government, OK, what happens if in fact you don't get any submarines? What's your plan B? They just say there's no need for plan B. So that means if plan A doesn't work and we have no control over whether it does, we end up with a big fat nothing.
Yeah, well, we had the UK Defence Minister here last week. We know there are reviews of AUKUS in the UK and the US. Where are they at, do you know?
Yeah, so the UK has done its own defence strategic review and fairly unsurprisingly come out in favour of the AUKUS submarine deal, because the UK does pretty well out of it in terms of, Australia investing $4 or $5 billion. I've lost track like you, around about $4 or $5 billion in the UK submarine building industry. And the review has also suggested that the AUKUS submarines themselves, which will be designed in the UK and then co-built, are essential for the UK's future security. Of course, other agencies of the UK defence industry have come out and said that the deal is effectively unachievable. The UK submarine industry is already behind on its 2 other submarine projects, so we've got no reason to think that it's going to successfully implement a new one. So that's where the UK review is at. And the US review we are still waiting for. It was supposed to come down after 30 days after the announcement, but there's been some delay, and we don't, I at least don't have a sense of when that will land. But the noise coming out of the US suggests that it may come back asking for more money, which is kind of unbelievable, and also a pre-commitment from Australia to supporting the United States in conflict, which was already built into the deal, of course. It's just a very Trumpian thing to say the quiet part out loud.
Could that be a get-out clause? I saw you in Parliament House last week. What chance of a review here?
Again, I think momentum is building, Glenn, and that kind of demand for a pre-commitment might create a bit more space for a review, because that would put the Australian government in an incredibly difficult position to be asked to pre-commit to participation in a conflict without, knowing the circumstances. So I think the political space is broadening for a review. We at the Australia Institute have our petition calling for an inquiry into AUKUS, which aimed initially to get 20,000 signatures. We've cracked that. I checked it this morning and it's at 23,500 signatures. There are other petitions that are seeing a level of success that is similar. And at the Victorian Labor State Conference over the weekend, the motion that was passed around AUKUS also calls for an independent parliamentary inquiry into the deal with full reference powers and asks that Australian participation in AUKUS is suspended while that review is underway. So it seems at least that there is pressure from a number of different directions calling for this parliamentary inquiry, including a Greens motion on the public notices that will maybe one day soon call for a vote into a parliamentary inquiry in the Senate.
Okay, let's come back to our theme that we opened the show with, that is killing the messenger. We saw Donald Trump fired the US government's labour statistics chief, seemingly because he didn't like that the jobs growth numbers had slowed. So firing people for telling the truth doesn't really sound like a recipe for good government.
No, it isn't. It's not exactly a surprise that Trump and the Trump administration aren't interested in good government or accurate information. So this is part of a fairly well-established pattern, I think.
So how's the US economy going? I saw Trump over the weekend once again say they're going into a golden age.
Yes, he would say that, wouldn't he? So actually his firing of the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics was apparently in direct response to some new numbers around US jobs. So the numbers that were released were considerably lower than the Trump administration had promised and was expecting and had been forecast. And so because he didn't like the numbers, he's gone ahead and fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the jobs numbers aren't great for Trump. And then there's some kind of mixed, I should hedge this by saying I'm not an economist, but, there has been some growth in US GDP, but it's all pretty messy, of course, because of the uncertainty that Trump is injecting into the economy. Private investment is kind of messy and going down because people are so unsure about what is happening. So the numbers are mixed. And the big one for Trump is that interest rates are still on hold. So he has been really stomping his feet about this because, of course, he promised to lower inflation. That was a big part of his campaign pitch. And interest rates are not going down, to his considerable frustration. And he is railing particularly against Jerome Powell, the head of the US Federal Reserve.
We call him Too Late. He's too late. It's his new nickname. It's Too Late Powell. He's a terrible Federal Reserve chairman. We have him there, and it was a mistake. I put him in, and then Biden extended him, and Biden only extended him because he knew I couldn't stand him. No, he's a political hack. Not very good. He's not a smart guy, Brian.
I'd be very surprised if he lasts much longer. Trump seems to be resisting giving him the flick, but it seems like it's probably coming. It would be Trump going against his usual patterns if Powell hangs around.
It was a pretty funny moment, though, last week when they're standing side by side and Powell's just going, "Nah, mate, you got that wrong. You're talking about a building that was built 5 years ago."
Yeah, it is wild. And we shouldn't underestimate as well the considerable bravery it takes to stand up to Trump in that way, to actively contradict him in front of the cameras, because we know he doesn't react particularly well to that. Just to go back to the point about bravery, it is a real risk. Like, we've got lots of examples of this standing up to Trump being very risky. Probably the most obvious example is Anthony Fauci, who stood up to Trump during the COVID pandemic and then was the subject of the wrath of Trump's kind of online MAGA world that spilled over into the real world, where Fauci was getting death threats and was the subject of roiling conspiracy theories, and then subject to Trump's vindictiveness when Trump rescinded his security detail that he needed because his life was under threat. So, we shouldn't underestimate again how risky it is to stand up to a president like this.
You talk about uncertainty in the economy. We got a little bit of certainty last week. Trump struck a deal with the EU, maybe the week before, called it the biggest deal ever. And then from an Australian point of view, we found out tariffs would stay at 10%. Is that a win for Australia, by the way?
Well, I think, our colleague, Dr. Greg Jericho, talks about this a lot in that, there's a lot of frothing about tariffs and the impact that they'll have on the Australian economy, when in reality, these are taxes that Americans will have to pay. These are, as our own government has described it, acts of economic self-harm that don't really hurt Australia. Again, without wanting to minimise the impact on certain industries, in the kind of broad economic impacts, they're relatively insignificant for Australia, but huge for American consumers. But that's not going to stop Trump. He doesn't care about
The
that.
Trade Minister, Don Farrell, says it's a win. Do you think the Australian government played this well? It didn't do lots of jumping up and down and stamping its feet. There was obviously some quiet diplomacy going on in the background.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of quiet diplomacy going on in the background, Glenn. A lot of scrambling, I think, to avoid the worst wrath of the Trump administration. I have some concerns, I think, about how they handled this, because if we look at beef imports, for example, Trump railed against an Australian ban on beef imports into Australia that was there because of biosecurity concerns. And not long ago, that ban was quietly dropped, and it was described as part of a scientific review, et cetera, but, I think fairly obviously was a concession, a very small one, to the Trump administration. And, that may work in the short term in terms of managing Trump, but we know he has made it very clear that it doesn't matter what you give him. He will move on to the next thing. He's already foreshadowing going after the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, for example, in Australia. And I have concerns about the kind of precedent you set when you give Trump concessions, however small, he will continue to expect them. That's how he operates. And, you mentioned the EU trade deal a little bit earlier. That has come under immense criticism in Europe as a capitulation to Trump, to no real end. Rightly, Trump, of course, is spinning that as a win. He's claiming the EU is going to invest, I think it's $600 billion or something in the US. He's saying that, this deal requires the EU to invest that much money. Figures in the EU are pointing out that it doesn't actually require that, and they can't do that legally. They can't force EU businesses to invest. So, it's the same kind of situation where Trump's just making stuff up and spinning it as a win, and in doing so kind of turning it into a win and forcing governments from the EU to Australia to kind of play the game his way.
Well, just to finish up then, is it working? Because I did mention in the intro that his popularity seemed to be falling. I know the polls are done differently in the US. Is his popularity tanking?
Yeah, his approval rating is tanking. It's really low. Last I checked, it was in the 30s, which is we would usually consider to be politically catastrophic, especially in the lead up to the midterms. But at the risk of repeating myself, Trump is a master of reestablishing narratives, of engaging in conspiracy to redirect blame, and also has no interest in running free and fair elections. So I don't think we can assume that tanking approval ratings, as much as they are tanking, will actually have an effect or an impact on, who is staffing future administrations.
Yeah, so he obviously can't run again, but the midterms is the key here, right?
That's right. Midterm elections will come up next year, and that's for Congress. And in a quote-unquote normal political cycle, we might see the opposition party reclaim a majority in Congress, especially looking at those approval ratings that we were talking about. But Trump is already making noise about doing things like redistricting in Texas in order to make sure that Republicans hold on to seats in Congress. He's already tried to overturn an election once. Like, why would we think he wouldn't try that again, especially if he thought he was going to lose? So, the midterms will be really important to watch. There are pretty concerning signs about that. And then, of course, there's already noise about presidential candidates and elections in 2028. You mentioned, Glenn, that he can't run, and legally he can't, but we also know that Trump doesn't particularly care what's written down in the US Constitution.
Oh, he also has children, God help us. Thanks, Emma.
Pleasure.
If you want to read more from the Australia Institute, you can pre-order the second edition in our Vantage Point series, Dead Centre, How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us, by Richard Dennis. Richard explores the contradiction between centrism and evidence that sits in the heart of the democratic debate in Australia. You can pre-order it now for $19.95 or become a subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. We'd love to get your thoughts on the show so far. You can send us feedback as well as episode and guest ideas to our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday the 4th of August. We'll be back next week. I'm Glenn Connley. Thanks for listening.